Chapter 1. The Race Begins. The Dilemma of Illusion. Long before there was race, and even before there was politics, there were the Saturday mornings in the playground. Every summer, on Saturday mornings, my father and I would greet the dawn. We'd have our breakfast, put on shorts and sneakers, walk across the street to the Martha Ruggles Elementary School playground, and practice basketball. My father was my first coach. He was a mathematics teacher by training, and his penchant for teaching extended to sports. He taught me how to catch a football and run a sprint. I played biddy basketball at the Chatham branch of the YMCA. My dad was the coach. An astute judge of talent, he recognized that his oldest son needed tutoring. And that's how those joyous Saturday morning sessions evolved. I was 8 years old. My shots barely reached the rim, but my dad constantly reminded me that there was a lot more to the game than shooting. He said that by the time I was able to hit the rim consistently, I'd have an idea of how to play the game. So we worked on fundamentals: dribbling, passing, catching. Now and then we play a game of one-on-one. He always won. For a change of pace, we'd run a foot race. He won that too. But what I loved most about Saturday morning was the bonding. Those practice sessions gave me an opportunity to be with my father, and be with him on a relatively equal playing field. At every turn, I measured my physical prowess against my father's. At every picnic, on every long walk, I challenged him to a race, keeping mental notes all along, noting how long he had to run hard before easing up and letting me win. He was still father, I was son. But I knew that one day, if I became strong enough, quick enough, big enough, competent enough, the dynamics of our athletic relationship would change. Those memories, carefully tucked away in my heart, are what make sports reverberate in my soul. Not covering the big games, interviewing celebrities and superstars, but childhood recollections of a boy trying to please his parents. The deepest, most ancient pull of sports, for me, has always been emotional. Race was something you did on the sidewalk, or on a dusty road on the way home from school. In the beginning, speed and quickness didn't have a color. My father tried to shield his 3 children from the brutality of the racial struggles that swirled about us in the 1950s. Every now and then he'd talk about some slight or indignity he suffered at the hands of a white person. Mostly he insulated us from the unfolding drama of the civil rights movement. Jackie Robinson desegregated Major League Baseball 3 years before I was born. But my father wasn't much of a baseball fan, so I wasn't shellacked in Jackie's legend of black Americans in the United States. My mother was not an avid sports fan, but she was the lion in my soul. Her brother, my Uncle Eddie, was a prize fighter in his younger days. My father called him the Canvas Kid. One day when I complained about Billy Boy, our next-door neighbor, my mother didn't advise me to turn the other cheek, or to ignore him, or to tell his mother. She essentially told me to go back and kick his ass. I remember the two of us standing in our kitchen, my mother giving me an impromptu boxing clinic. I can still hear her voice as she showed me how to throw a combination. "Bop, bop, just like that," she said, showing me how to deck Billy Boy. I never did fight Billy Boy. I faced him in the yard soon after my mother's tutorial, but couldn't bring myself to throw the first punch. This was my first lesson in combat. Power without heart and strategy is meaningless. My mother laid out the racial facts of life for me. She burst my bubble in our kitchen one afternoon when she said casually that there were more white people than black people in the United States. I was stunned. In my segregated world on Chicago's South Side, black and brown were the dominant colors. In my world, white people were there, but not there, invisible. The stores, the laundromat, the record shops, my schools. If whites were the majority, where were they? Why didn't I ever see any? Of course, the answers to these questions flowed into the larger ocean of segregation and racism. That, in turn, flowed back to the ritual my dad and I enacted when we watched sports. I learned about race and racism in front of the TV set. My father and I watched football games upstairs in our bungalow on 78th and Calumet. We sat and cheered on the red leather seat my dad had pulled out of our 56 Mercury station wagon. Televised football didn't make a lot of sense to me back then. The images were too crowded, too small, too gray. The fun of it was cheering, and cheering interests were simple in our house. We rooted for the team with the most black players. We cheered for the hometown clubs, the Bears and White Sox. But aside from that, the general rule of thumb was that we cheered for the team with the most colorful presents. In those days, when black faces were few and far between, we cheered for the color of the skin. We had some variations to the general rule. If the team was from the South and had just one brother, his team was our team. He was our man. Didn't matter who the athlete was underneath his uniform or his skin. His true character was less significant than his presence. Out there on the field, he became the torchbearer for the race. Content of character mattered only to the extent that we prayed these pioneers wouldn't embarrass the race. The ritual my dad and I engaged in was one that took place among black sports fans and non-fans throughout the United States. The ritual went further back than Jackie Robinson, Joe Louis, or Jesse Owens. It probably went all the way back to the heavyweight prize fighter Jack Johnson in 1910, when the telegram runners passed through black neighborhoods calling out round-by-round progress of Johnson's historic fight with Jim Jeffries, the first great white hope. When Johnson defeated Jeffries on July 4, 1910, black communities across the country exploded in celebration. Other parts of the nation exploded with violence. As news of Johnson's victory spread, mobs of angry whites beat up and, in some instances, murdered blacks. Many whites feared that the black community might be emboldened by Johnson's victory over a white man. And they were not mistaken. Those early symbolic victories were soul food. Symbolic representation was the rule of the day, part of a timeless ritual throughout the United States melting pot of ethnicity. Jews cheered for Jews, Irish for Irish, Italians for Italians. But the predicament of black Americans was more complex, precarious, and sometimes seemed even hopeless. African Americans were so disconnected from the American dream that sports often seemed the only venue where the battle for self-respect could be vigorously waged. My parents and their parents sat around their radios, listening to Joe Louis fights, living and dying with every punch. Louis was fighting for himself and his country, but he was also fighting for a black nation within a nation. Every time Jackie Robinson went to bat, he did so for that elusive, ever-evolving state of mind called Black America. In those days of suffocating, uncompromising segregation, we cheered black muscle with a vengeance. The fate of black civilization seemed to rest on every ground, every at-bat. Knock his white ass out, or outrun his white ass, or block that white boy shot, or worst of all, you let that white boy beat you. Each group had its cross to bear, but although Jews and Italians and Irish and all the other mingling European races could look forward to assimilating, assimilation was practically impossible for African Americans. The indelible marking of skin color made it so. Early in the formation of the United States, blacks became the designated drivers of the scapegoat express. We were the indecent others. The nation needed a permanent workforce and a permanent pariah. African Americans, by virtue of some 17th century decree, got the job. No amount of education, no amount of wealth could remove the stigma of race. The paradox and dilemma of virulent racism is that our exclusion became the basis of our unity. The next 200 years of our existence were defined by reacting to racism. So our cheering assumed a deeper meaning. We were cheering for our very survival. Black athletes became our psychological armor, markers of our progress, tangible proof of our worth, evidence of our collective soul. Our athletes threw punches we couldn't throw, won races we couldn't run. Any competition or public showing involving an African American was seen as a test for us all. The job of the athlete was to represent the race. This was a heavy burden on the one hand, but on the other it represented a noble, time-worn responsibility. You always represented. Paul Robeson, All-American football player, activist, orator, singer, actor, never forgot his first day as a freshman football player at Rutgers when white teammates tried to kill him and nearly succeeded. Robeson never forgot his father's angry reaction when he was informed that his son was thinking about quitting the team and Rutgers. His father told him that quitting was not an option, regardless of how trying conditions became. When I was out on the football field or in the classroom or just anywhere else, I was not there just on my own. I was the representative of a lot of Negro boys who wanted to play football and wanted to go to college. And as their representative, I had to show that I could take whatever was handed out. The attitude exemplified by Robeson's father was widely embraced by African Americans. The idea that we were each connected to a national black community by a common experience, a common condition, and a common cause was commonplace. Floyd Patterson was the first African American athlete I can personally remember who carried the burden of the race into the ring. Patterson became heavyweight champion in 1956, the youngest ever at the time. Soft-spoken and self-effacing, Patterson was the perfect media story. A young, wayward black boy transformed by a caring white patron, Cus D'Amato, into a champion. In June of 1959, he defended his title against Ingemar Johansson and was pummeled without mercy. Johansson knocked Patterson down 7 times in 3 rounds, and to many of us, it felt as if black folks had been knocked out. But Patterson came back and won the rematch in June 1960, becoming the first fighter ever to regain the heavyweight championship. This was one of those psychic victories for black America, all the sweeter because Patterson proved all his doubters wrong. But then things got complicated. Patterson's next opponent was Charles Sonny Liston, an illiterate former convict with mob connections, whom the New York State Athletic Commission described thus: a child of circumstances, without schooling, and without direction or leadership. He has become the victim of those with whom he has surrounded himself. The scholar Maurice Berube called Liston the stereotypical nightmare of the bad nigger, the juvenile delinquent grown up. That was the first time I was confronted with the new complexities of race brought on by the nascent civil rights movement. Liston was no Floyd Patterson. That is, he was not the model civil rights Negro, beloved by all, especially by whites. So here were 2 black men fighting for the championship. Liston was regarded as a pariah. Patterson was cast as the good black. Even John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, weighed in, telling Patterson that he had to, quote, beat that guy, because a Liston victory would not be in the best interest of the Negro image. The fight definitely was not in Patterson's best interest. Liston pulverized Patterson in their first fight in September 1962, knocking him out in 2 minutes of the first round. Even Malcolm X, like Liston, a threat to both whites and the civil rights model, weighed in on the 1963 Liston-Patterson rematch, expressing the hope that Liston would, quote, shake Patterson up. That he did. Liston beat Patterson even worse in their 1963 rematch. Then along came Cassius Marcellus Clay. Clay triggered an odd transformation in the country, in my household, and within the African American community. Liston's mob connections were one thing, but Clay's connection to the black Muslims frightened a lot of blacks and whites a whole lot more. He had been recruited into the Nation of Islam by none other than Malcolm X, the radical minister who spoke of whites as blue-eyed devils. Suddenly, Big Bad Sonny Liston was redefined. He became reassuring to an older generation of blacks who, like the old heavyweight model Liston, represented and were intimidated by Clay's brashness and connection to the Nation of Islam. A conservative segment of the community was screaming, quote, "Enough of this militant business. Enough of this talk of separation of blue-eyed devils." They hoped that Clay would be crushed, silenced, dashed to bits by the bear. It didn't happen. Clay the radical defeated Liston the thug to become heavyweight champion. Later he fought Patterson and humiliated him in defeat because the former champion refused to call Clay by his new name, Muhammad Ali. Those of us who were younger and beginning to develop a more militant racial consciousness were thrilled by Ali. We called any black person who refused to call Ali by his name old Negroes, Uncle Toms, or the white man's niggas. Ali became the first universal, seemingly omnipresent black man. He said things we only imagined saying, did things many of us had never conceived of doing. He shunned his slave name, Clay, for Ali. He refused to be inducted into the U.S. Army and risked everything, including the heavyweight championship, for principle. When Ali was stripped of his title, it was as if he were being whipped by the overseer, like those, quote, bad nigger slaves of old. Publicly. We were outraged at the injustice, but inspired by his courage and fearlessness, which were as strong outside the ring as they were within the four corners. Ali was my Jackie Robinson, the sports figure who transcended sport to become a true role model. His example gave many of us strength, black and white, rich and poor. For me, Ali brought home the concept of principle, that there was something greater in life than wealth. Though wealth has its place, something greater in life than fame, though fame has its place. And he taught me that in the right hands, wealth and fame, the fruits of athletic success, could be used as a tool in the ongoing struggle. My junior and senior years in high school were dominated by two shocking events: Malcolm X's assassination in February 1965 and Dr. King's assassination in April 1968. When I left for Morgan State in August of 1968, my head was filled with conflicting visions of unity and revolt. Dr. King's dream and Malcolm's warning of blue-eyed devils. There were kernels of truth in each vision. When my dad and I watched football games on that black and white TV, the black athlete, low in numbers, with so much to prove, was a symbol. The struggle was about representation on the field. Ultimately, I realized that cheering for the team with the most black players begged the question. By the summer of 1968, our dilemma as athletes, was where we fit into the black power equation, what our role was to be in the liberation movement. From Jack Johnson to Joe Louis, from Jackie Robinson to Wilma Rudolph, black athletes had been effective symbols. How could African American athletes now become the energy inside the movement? I figured the first step was to become part of strong black institutions. I made my college football debut in Yankee Stadium on September 28, 1968, my freshman year. Morgan State versus Grambling State in an eagerly awaited showdown between two titans of black college football. It wasn't much of a debut, one of 4 freshmen to make the squad. I was in uniform but didn't play in the game. I was just happy to be there. This was our first game of the season. Grambling second. Both teams were on the roll. Morgan hadn't lost since the 4th game of the 1964 season, a span of 26 games. Grambling was the defending black national champion. The teams had played each other only once before, in 1945. Back then, using a band and a football team, Ralph Waldo Jones, the Grambling president, sought to turn Grambling into the Notre Dame of black college football. Eddie Robinson, going strong as the Grambling coach in 1968, was hired in 1941 as part of President Jones's plan to put the tiny school in northern Louisiana on the map. Robinson's first big move following World War II was to play Morgan, a nationally recognized power. Morgan won that 1945 meeting 35-0. But Robinson kept working. Grambling kept improving, and by September 1968, Grambling had more players on professional football rosters than any other college except Notre Dame. This game against Morgan would be the crowning glory for Grambling, and would put Morgan, which had built a second dynasty under its coach, Earl Banks, in the national limelight. The game itself, the historic setting, and the underlying theme of black pride made this Morgan-Grambling rumble important beyond the final score. This clash between two historically black colleges in a major stadium in New York was a perfect illustration of the power of the African American college, the power of the African American consumer, and the power of the African American athlete at the historically black institution, all empowered to determine their own definitions of success. There were a number of forces that made the game a reality. Two beer companies, Rheingold and Ballantine, were fighting for control of market share. Rheingold was first. Ballantine, running a close second, agreed to sponsor the game with the idea of increasing its take of the lucrative black consumer market. The National Football League also supported the game. Buddy Young, one of the first African American stars in the league, had been Banks' teammate at Phillips High School in Chicago and now worked in the league commissioner's office. The National Football League had once ignored players from historically black colleges. The league had gotten religion in the past 5 years because players from historically black colleges were instrumental in helping the rival American Football League keep pace with the NFL and ultimately forced a merger 2 years later. In 1967, Willie Lanier, who played at Morgan from 1963 to 1967, beat out Jim Lynch, the former Notre Dame All-American, for the starting middle linebacker position of the powerful Kansas City Chiefs. Lanier was the first African American to start and star at middle linebacker. Lanier's accomplishment was as significant in many ways as the Morgan-Grambling game itself. In 1967, middle linebacker was regarded as a quote-unquote white position, along with free safety and to a lesser extent strong safety, offensive guard, and quarterback, of course. These positions required smarts and good judgment, attributes that white players had and black players, according to stereotypes of their day, lacked. Until Tank Younger of Grambling was drafted by the Rams in 1949, athletes from historically black colleges were ignored by the NFL in favor of black players from predominantly white colleges. Most NFL scouts felt that black college players lacked the talent to play professional football. There was also an unstated but keenly felt opinion among NFL management that black players from predominantly white institutions knew how to play with white players. In other words, they knew their place. League officials were anxious about how black players from black colleges would adjust to playing alongside white players and accepting subordinate positions. Coach Robinson said, quote, "Tank, this is a great opportunity for black college football. If you fail, it's no telling when another player will get an opportunity. They'll say, we took the best you had and he failed." Younger enjoyed a stellar NFL career, 1949 to 1958, and was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 2000. The Urban League, then led by Whitney Young, embraced the game as a means of reaching out to the black community following the devastating urban riots that summer. Proceeds from the game were supposed to go to the Street Academy, a Harlem-based initiative sponsored by the Urban League, designed to help teenage dropouts return to school. Young, who had been denounced by fiery Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. as, quote, Whitey Young, saw sponsorship of the game as a way to counter a growing sentiment that moderate civil rights leaders were selling out to white political interests. None of us was aware of it at the time, but the subject had become so heated that a former black school principal in New York City had been arrested in New York for making threats to assassinate Young. Roy Wilkins and other civil rights leaders who he thought were selling out the mass of African Americans to white interests in exchange for position, personal gain, and prestige. The internecine violence, symbolized by Malcolm's murder, reflected a complicated new development. Where previously our anger had been turned on whites, it was now also trained on those blacks who supposedly acted as agents of white interests, so-called Uncle Toms. Integration added a layer of complexity to black unity that hitherto had not existed. 8 months before the game, Sammy Young Jr., a freshman at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, the black school founded by Booker T. Washington, went to a filling station about a block off the Tuskegee town square and used the white men's room. The white filling station owner was so enraged that a Negro had dared to use his toilet, a public facility, that he shot him dead. An all-white jury acquitted the owner. Robert Kennedy was murdered in June of that year. In August, the Chicago police routed protesters at the Democratic National Convention. The most traumatic event took place in April, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Dr. King's death triggered weeks of rioting across the country. With unrest and revolution erupting around the world, and with the civil rights movement in full and bloody bloom, Morgan Grambling was an intriguing subplot in the violent drama being played out in the United States. In fact, this game was a footnote to Dr. King's death, for it was at his funeral in Atlanta that Coach Banks and Coach Robinson signed the contract to play the game. Although there was no formal dedication, the inaugural Morgan Grambling game would be played in Dr. King's memory. This added to the powerful spirit in Yankee Stadium that afternoon. The big question surrounding the inaugural classic was whether there was enough interest in the game between historical black schools, one from Maryland, one from Louisiana, to attract a crowd in New York. Could they fill Yankee Stadium? When our Morgan State team bus rolled up beside Yankee Stadium the Friday before the game, the marquee in front shouted the answer in big, bold letters. Morgan vs. Grambling. Sold out. No tickets available. By 4 o'clock Friday afternoon, we had finished a light workout at McCombs Dam Park, next to Yankee Stadium. As the bus pulled out of the Yankee Stadium parking lot and prepared to take us back to our hotel in Midtown Manhattan, Coach Banks' gruff voice thundered down the aisles, rolled up to where the driver sat, and commanded, "Let's go back through Harlem." Our bus rumbled over the McCombs Dam Bridge into Manhattan, and then up the 155th Street Viaduct. Then we made a left turn into another space and time, a turn into Harlem, USA. I'd heard about Harlem in high school, a tough area, the capital of black America. Harlem was the place of dreams. To be here, live, and in color was electric. 2 years earlier in his book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, author Howard Cruz had described Harlem as, quote, a community that still represents the Negro's strongest bastion in America from which to launch whatever group effort he is able to mobilize for political power, economic rehabilitation, and cultural re-identification." End quote. We reached 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, the heart of the neighborhood, at 5 o'clock. The eagle flies on Friday, and this Friday the eagle seemed to be flying especially high. It was the end of another hard week. Spirits were soaring. Brothers and sisters of all shades of brown walked the streets, talking and laughing, flirting and flaunting. Horns honked, music blared. This was one great busy drama of huge afros and processed hair. Black women were dressed in earth-toned African dresses or in hot pants and hoop earrings. Red, black, and green liberation flags flew everywhere. Sensory overload. Street corner revolutionaries on speakers denounced blue-eyed devils on one corner. Jehovah's Witnesses proselytized lost souls on another. Cars double parked. Cool cats sported canary yellow suits, while Superfly brothers in shades leaned against shining Eldorados with gangster white walls. One brother was driving a convertible with a leopard skin top. Coach Banks was the resident expert on Harlem. An all Big Ten guard at Iowa, Banks played professionally for the New York Yankees of the All-America Football Conference before a knee injury cut his career short. He'd earned his master's degree from New York University. Like most football coaches, Earl Banks was a dictator. What made him tolerable, even enjoyable, was that his life contained a rich reservoir of experience, and he built a rapport with everyone from hustlers and tavern owners to the white drugstore owner in Iowa who had talked him out of quitting Iowa's football team. Coach Banks had an anecdote for every situation, and he would use the gospel preacher's inflection or the piercing vernacular of the street to deliver masterpieces of storytelling. As we passed through Harlem, he pointed out the hot spots, the Hotel Teresa, the Red Rooster, and the Showman's Lounge. "You can always tell the prostitutes," he advised, "because they wear white boots." In 1966, Stokely Carmichael, then chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, espoused a dramatic paradigm shift for African Americans called Black Power. The name bespoke unity and called for Black America to consolidate its resources to achieve political and economic power. The Harlem I glimpsed that afternoon captured the essence of that slogan. Harlem felt like the spiritual and cultural capital of Black America. In my eyes, Harlem defined the essence of the revolution, a revolution that had escalated the day Martin Luther King was assassinated. Dr. King's death was a signal that the nonviolent phase of the movement was over. His assassination ended a chapter in the civil rights movement that symbolically began in 1955 when Rosa Parks sat down on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and refused to get up for the white man who had demanded her seat. Between 1955 and 1968, protest was aimed at eliminating segregation. After King's death, the impetus, at least in my mind, was no longer asking whites for access or approval, but pushing for autonomy, empowerment, and self-definition. We were entering a new phase of the struggle. I certainly was. We were no longer appealing for understanding from white society or asking to be allowed into its castle. We would build castles of our own, build strategies and programs that gave us a voice and power. There seemed to be a new wave of struggle, a new way of thinking about things. We were taking all of the raw components of our lives and turning them into revolutionary weapons. Even our music was revolutionary. Nina Simone's Young, Gifted, and Black. Curtis Mayfield's We're a Winner. James Brown's I'm Black and I'm proud. I was just getting into jazz. There was a whole genre of so-called protest music. Many of the masters of the music were strong, independent black men and women who used their music as a vehicle, as a powerful expression of pride, anger, frustration, and hope. In my mind, the Morgan Grambling game sprang from a spirit of independence. In our own way, we were part of an emerging new phase of resistance. Athletics was part of the revolution. The teams came out for the pre-game introductions and were greeted by a thunderous roar, which together with the blaring of the bands formed a great sheet of sound. As I ran out on the field, I looked up. As far as I could see, nothing but Grambling black and gold and Morgan orange and blue. John Frenchie Fuqua, Morgan's star running back, remembered the only thing he was thinking about was not embarrassing himself when he ran out for the introductions. Quote, I was just praying, Lord, please don't let me trip and fall. Frank Lewis, the Grambling wingback, was mesmerized, not by the crowd or the stadium, but by the historic moment the game represented. Quote, what stood out in my mind was that here were two black schools playing in New York. Morgan State had that 26-0 record. That was the only thing that was exciting to me. I was thinking about how big a game it was. I didn't focus on the city and the stadium, just that two black universities had sold out the stadium at a neutral site, and that was something that wasn't happening too often. It was almost like it was some national game. End quote. Morgan scored on the fourth play of the game, a 47-yard pass to Raymond Chester. Grambling answered just before the half with a 37-yard pass from Frank Holmes to Frank Lewis to tie the game. In the locker room at the intermission, Coach Banks gave a classic halftime performance. He slung the blackboard around and furiously scribbled X's and O's. Above one X, he wrote the number 81 and circled it. Billy Newsome was Grambling's defensive end. Newsome had single-handedly scuttled our, quote, 46 power, a running play that hadn't been stopped in 4 years. We're making this Lemon look like an All-American, Banks roared. Newsome was in fact an All-American. 7 Grambling players and 3 of ours would be drafted the following spring. Coach Banks glared at the 2 players responsible for blocking Newsome and scrawled some new blocking schemes on the board. When one of the players tried to say something, Banks cut him off and roared, I want you to put your head in his gut, and I want you to drive him out of there. In his fury, he drew the line all the way off the blackboard. The chalk snapped and broke into little pieces as it hit the floor. Early in the fourth quarter, Grambling lined up deep in its own territory to punt the ball. On the sideline, Coach Banks grabbed Ray Chester, who had played a great game at tight end, and tossed him in as defensive end. During the course of the season, I would learn that Coach Banks believed in inspirational substitutions. In the heat of the moment, if someone was screwing up, he'd roar, I need someone to rush the passer, or I need someone who can block. He'd grab the closest player and say, can you do it? The answer always had better be yes, or you might not play for the rest of your career. Chester stormed across the line and blocked the punt. The ball rolled out of the end zone for a safety, and Morgan led 9-7. Now, Eddie Robinson was forced to use Grambling's secret weapon, James Shaq Harris. In truth, Harris was anything but a secret. At 6'4", 215 pounds, with a powerful arm and a drop-back style, scouts predicted that Harris would become the first African-American quarterback to, quote-unquote, make it big in the National Football League. In the fall of 1968, quarterback was the sacred position reserved for white players only. The history of black quarterbacks in the NCAA and NFL was limited. Willie Thrower had played for the Chicago Bears in 1953. Sandy Stevens had led the University of Minnesota to the Rose Bowl but had never played professionally. Eldridge Dickey, a star ambidextrous quarterback at Tennessee State, was drafted by Oakland and actually beat out Ken Stabler for the starter's job. But Dickey, like many talented black athletes before him, was ahead of his time, part of an era when athleticism in a quarterback was a dirty word. Dickey was eventually switched to wide receiver. But Shaq had all of the quote-unquote necessities. Harris nearly passed up the opportunity to play professional football. Drafted by the Buffalo Bills in the 8th round of the 1969 draft, Harris was demoralized over not being drafted sooner. He felt slighted and devalued. If not for a pep talk from Eddie Robinson, his coach and mentor, Shaq might not have reported to camp. While Harris contemplated whether to report to the Buffalo Bills training camp, Robinson took him to Grambling's football stadium one afternoon and laid out the historical facts of life. Harris's decision, Robinson explained, had to be based on something much larger than his disappointment over not being a higher pick. He said, "If I didn't go, we might not ever have a black quarterback in the pros," Harris told me years later. "We sat on the bleachers, just me and him. He told me that there was no question that I would make it as a quarterback, but if I didn't go, I might be keeping other guys from getting a chance. If I didn't go, it would be hard for anyone else because he thought it would be a long time before another black quarterback came along with my ability." James Harris reported to camp and in 1974 became the first African American to start a regular season game as quarterback. Harris would play 12 seasons in the NFL. In 1999, he became one of the few African Americans in the league's front office, as director of pro personnel for the Baltimore Ravens. Baltimore won the Super Bowl in 2001. In January 2003, Shaq was hired as vice president of player personnel for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Fortunately for Morgan, on this particular autumn afternoon in 1968, Shaq was hurt. He'd injured his ankle playing pickup basketball before the season and had missed most of Grambling's opening game against Alcorn State. Robinson wanted to hold him out of this game too, but here in the fourth quarter in New York, on the greatest stage of his career, Robinson had no choice. Even Robinson had miscalculated the magnitude of this game, and he may have underestimated Morgan. Now, with his back against the wall, Coach Robinson reluctantly yielded to the moment. He signaled Harris into action. Harris made a dramatic entrance onto the field from the Grambling sideline. He made his way slowly, visibly limping. He ducked into the huddle as Grambling fans went wild. 4 times the officials had to stop the clock as the frenzied crowd drowned out Harris in his attempts to call the signals. Grambling started on its own 23-yard line with 3:36 left to play. Harris completed 4 passes on the drive. Zip to Charlie Joyner. Zip to Lewis. Zip to Joyner. Then he hit Lewis with a 37-yard pass to the 1-yard line with 37 seconds left. The stage was set for a finish that could not have been believably scripted, a goal line stand in the biggest game in black college football history. Grambling's fullback, Henry Jones, gained nothing on the first down. A second down pass fell incomplete, and Jones gained just inches on third down. Now, it was 4th and goal from the 1 with 16 seconds to play. Eddie Hayes, our senior safety and team captain, remembered having a sinking feeling that Grambling would kick a field goal and Morgan would lose 10-9. Instead, Robinson valiantly chose to go for it. Later he would explain that Grambling's field goal kicker was unreliable. I will believe to the end of time, however, that Robinson wanted to make a point. 6 points, actually. He wanted to run the ball down Morgan's throat. The crowd was going crazy. Shaq was raising his hands, wasting precious seconds trying to quiet the crowd. He didn't call a timeout. The clock was running, and Grambling had to rush the play. Jones took one final plunge into the line. There was a tremendous collision as Chester and the entire Morgan defense collided with the 245-pound Jones and the rest of the Grambling offense. The referee took what seemed like several minutes to disentangle the players and determine whether Jones had scored. Chester, unconscious, was later carried off the field to great ovation. As the official continued to dissect the pile, the tension mounted, and the stadium fell practically silent. I remember looking around and wondering how 64,000 fans, who had been so raucous all afternoon, could suddenly be so still. Finally, the official held the ball over his head and flipped it up in the air. The game was over. Morgan held. The winning streak was alive at 27. The stadium, host to another epic, erupted in a loud burst of cheers and shrieks. Now black, gold, orange, and blue all mixed together. I watched Ed Hayes walk off the field crying. Saw Frank Lewis on the other side crying. Players on both sides were overcome, not just from the effects of a hard-fought game, but over the recognition of a historic event. Black folks had come to New York and put on a grand spectacle. What had been invisible had become visible, from the great athletes on the field to the dollars and wallets of a black community. This was the same untapped potential that the Brooklyn Dodgers general manager Branch Rickey had observed 2 decades earlier when he attended Negro League games and felt a surge of black power that he craved to capture for his Dodgers. This place, this trip, this football game was the harbinger of promise, of all that could be, not integration on white society's terms, but self-sufficiency. We didn't need to add to anyone's empire and all the negatives associated with it. We needed strong, enduring African American institutions in which black people could have a defining say in matters that affected their expanding community. This was the dawning of a new day. Black athletes, black institutions, black folk flexing their economic and cultural muscle in a collective way. This inaugural Morgan Grambling afternoon was a model of possibility of how sports could be used to achieve a greater good. The athlete could be something more than an entertainment bloodhound. That afternoon at Yankee Stadium conjured up memories of Negro League baseball games of the 1940s and Harlem Ren basketball games at the Renaissance Ballroom. This was a snapshot of our past, our present, and I hoped, our future. I walked off the Yankee Stadium turf bursting with pride, thankful to be part of something this big, this black, this beautiful. We had the athletes, had the fans, had the money. This day, I thought, was the beginning of something. After all that had happened in 1968, the assassinations, the riots, the protests, things would never be the same again. There was no going back. I felt that something new had awakened in us. 25 years later, I would still be waiting. The dream was a mirage. Harlem, 2003. Spirits echo as another dawn overtakes Harlem. Soft bursts of purples, oranges, and blues fan out over the Harlem River. Amber street lights framed by my living room window glow like fireflies peeking through a scattering of trees. Buildings cast long shadows in all shapes and sizes. The morning's pastels illuminate ribbons of highways and rails that bring in the noise and funk from the suburbs and points north, the wild beats of the inner city, the jungle rhythms, the soul that inspires so much romance and lore, yield to this peaceful early morning interlude, a warm-up act for the bustling, full-scale drama of daybreak. This is my home. This is Harlem. The area is Sugar Hill. The building is 409. For most of the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, 409 Edgecombe Avenue was one of the most prestigious addresses in Harlem for African Americans. The building was completed during World War I. The first black family moved into 409 in 1929. The building quickly became home for many luminaries of black society. W.E.B. Du Bois, the father of black sociology, Walter White and Roy Wilkins, executive secretaries of the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, the first black Supreme Court justice, Jacob Lawrence, artist, Elizabeth Catlett, sculptor, Lucky Roberts and Jimmy Lunsford, musicians, Marvell Cook, who worked as Du Bois's field secretary, lived in 409 from 1932 until her death in 2001. Cook once told me that the great Babe Ruth lived at 409 in the early 1920s and kept an apartment on the 13th floor. A number of New York Yankees had lived in 409, she said. I never heard that, but it made sense. Yankee Stadium is a 15-minute walk from 409. Turn left out of the building, make a quick right down the 155th Street Viaduct, walk across the McCombs Dam Bridge over the Harlem River and the Major Deegan Expressway, down the winding ramp, past the handball courts, and you're at the stadium press gate. What an amazing transition. When I walked off the field in 1968, I never would have guessed that the arc of time would carry me back to Harlem. In retrospect, that Morgan Grambling game was the beginning of a bridge, a transition from the black world in which I had been raised and a white-controlled sports industry in which I would work. As much as I enjoy the memory of that idyllic autumn day in 1968, time has crystallized realities in a way that has made me realize that 1968 was a mirage. Just as I realized in 1968 that the issues we were confronting were deeper than the simple lessons on race I had absorbed on those afternoons with my father, the years since 1968 have taught me that the issues go deeper than the powerful symbolism of one game. The idea that athletes, given a forum, would all follow the example of Ali and Tommy Smith and John Carlos has been shown to be mistaken. The notion that black people, once they infiltrated the world of sports in sufficient numbers, would follow the example of Curt Flood and work to change the economic exploitation of the sports industry was wrong. The idea that soul, black style, and artistry was the one thing that couldn't be appropriated and commoditized by white power has proven to be laughably false. And the black institutions that I thought would be the vanguard of the revolution have been stripped bare by the progressively rapacious forces of sports capitalism. Even the Harlem I thought I saw in 1968 was an illusion. The streets teeming with the colors and sounds of black folks did not match the reality of white ownership. Like the sports industry they quote-unquote dominate, African Americans were not in control of this community. They merely rented. On 125th Street, for example, 95% of the consumers are black, while 95% of the stores are owned by non-black people. This mirrored the world I discovered as jazz critic for the Baltimore Sun between 1978 and 1982, and the world of sports I covered for the New York Times beginning in 1982. Black on the outside, white controlled on the inside. Harlem was a plantation. And to understand just how deep the dilemma of the black athlete goes, that's the metaphor we return to again and again, the plantation. Because the heart of the dilemma I eventually came to understand is the quest for power. Power as illustrated by on-the-field representation, power as demonstrated in off-the-field control, power as symbolized by physical domination, power articulated as political revolution. The plantation is the enduring metaphor because that quest for power began with the attempt to assert control over our individual lives and freedom in the hellish years of literal bondage. For black athletes in the United States, the roots of black muscle are buried in the blood-soaked plantations of Virginia, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Georgia, where the majority of slaves were first brought to America for their physical labor. The plantation is where the black athlete's dramatic march through history began. The roots of this tribe of black athletes run deeper than the fable of Jackie Robinson, deeper than the myth of Joe Louis or the legend of Jesse Owens, deeper even than the spectacle of a defiant Jack Johnson pummeling the great white hope into submission at the turn of the century. To understand the plantation is to begin to understand the present dilemma. So it's to the plantation that we will return to begin to unravel the dimensions of the black athlete's centuries-long quest for power.